issue in industrial competitiveness. When it comes to competitiveness of a firm, well, there is another, again, very much difference. For example, in firm competitiveness of firm, national boundary does not mean anything. A company in Korea can become very competitive by leaving Korea and establishing its headquarters somewhere outside Korea. And still, it can be considered very competitive, while for a Korean national competitiveness, it may be harmful. Korean companies leaving Korea may jeopardize competitiveness of a nation. So we have to think of this competitiveness differently. So with that in mind, my answer to your question is, indeed, there are a number of different ways companies can create competitiveness. Well, it certainly depends on the general environment. Take, for example, in the earlier days of Korean economic development, in the 60s and 70s, the history showed that perhaps diversification, growing as a chaebol style, was probably a better strategy than focus or concentration in one industry. But perhaps nowadays, late 20th century and entering the 21st century, perhaps at this moment, concentration might be better strategy. It does not mean, however, diversification is not the right choice for any companies. It also depends not only on the environment, but also the philosophy and the values system of the individual who leads the company. So there are many factors that influence the success of the firm, which will eventually lead to competitiveness. So my suggestion is, it is not the strategy itself, but the way the strategy is implemented within the context, within the environment, and the resources the company has. So I'm not sure that I'm giving you the clean answer, but competitiveness of a firm is as complicated as anything else.
Okay, we have 7.5 minutes about, so I'll give each presenter 1.5 minutes for your closing remarks, and we'll close the session. You first, Dr. Moon? You have 1.5 minutes.
Well, let me give some comments on the two questions. I think the two questions are very important. Number one was about the usefulness of benchmarking strategy. Like the Singapore is quite different from Korea, and can you copy it? And because of the complexities of the differences in systems. And the answer by Dr. Siong was excellent. You don't look at just the appearance, but you have to look at the principles of kind of those competitiveness. And I think we have some cases like USA and Korea and Singapore and Finland, and these are good examples. There are fundamental underlying principles for the competitiveness of each industry. Number one is Singapore is actually what Dr. Siong said is government policy, but I would say globalization, and that is a really good, So we can benchmark like a global trend or the important meaning of globalization from the experience of Singapore. So this is kind of good principle. And Finland is innovation. Again, Korea is quite different from Finland, but we can copy some of the innovative kind of philosophy or principles of Finland. USA is diverse, but I would say that the most important competitive advantage of USA is heterogeneity, diversification. They're ready to accept like different philosophies and opinions like that is actually fundamental philosophy of USA competitive. So we can copy the directions or the principles of these very successful economies. The second question was about the concentration on one industrial sector, or you need to be diversified. Principally, I'd like to be concentrated only one, but the environments are changing. Even Nokia, the most competitive company in Finland, has changed its business areas from like a forest-oriented kind of some other perps and tires and some other things, and then eventually electronics. So we have to adjust to the differences in environment. And if you are really super, you can change the environment. Otherwise, you have to adjust to the environment. Thank you.
Dr. Hermans?
Thank you. I go back to the company level versus national level. You know, the fact is that the target of any company in the world is to maximize shareholder value, especially if the company is owned publicly by many investors. Then there is always a tendency that the corporate management have to conduct the strategy and implement the strategy in the way that they, for example, reduce production costs. And if that is against the national competitiveness of any country, that can be. But the interests can be aligned, but we must remember that, let's take an example of Nokia. 90% of Nokia shares are owned by foreigners. So any decision that Nokia leaders do, they have to take care that they maximize shareholder value. And if Finland is the best place for headquarters or the place to conduct research and development activity, then it be. They stay in Finland. But there are all other alternatives. And so that's my closing remark, that we have to remember that globalization impacts huge changes, even especially in corporate level, and that has an impact on national competitiveness. That's why I like the Singapore model, that they go back to the human, how to attract skillful humans into their state. Thank you.
How about Dr. Bates? Do you have anything more to say?
I always have something more to say. Definitely less than 1 minute. I think what we all agree on up here is that the one constant is change. And corporations and businesses have to be able to adapt if they're going to survive. We haven't talked much about the education system, but universities and education systems have to change in order to survive and to be training the next generation with skills they're going to need. But also individuals have to be adaptable, and we all have to be willing to re-educate ourselves and reinvent ourselves and understand how the pace of change and new technologies are impacting our careers, the opportunities we have. I think certainly in America, the younger generation is much more willing to move, to travel overseas, to take employment overseas than perhaps the older generation is, and I think we're going to see that trend continue, and that's something that's going to be very interesting to watch and see how that impacts our national competitiveness as individuals follow what is happening with large companies and become more globally aware and globally engaged.
Dr. Siong, you can close them.
Thank you. I think just following up from what Bill says, I think the reality is that competitive advantages, whether at the company level or the country level, are temporary at best. They last only for a period of time, and then you have to change again. Because the world is changing very fast. And unless at the company level, at the country level, we continue to adapt our business environment, our policies, and our strategy to the new requirements, which are increasingly much more complex, much more sophisticated, and also heavily burdened with significant risks that we do not understand. Unless we constantly change, no country can stay competitive forever. No company can stay competitive forever. In a sense, by looking at various models, we learn the different possibilities, and our minds are open. And that really is ultimately our main competitive advantage, to be willing to be open and to recognize when circumstances have changed, and therefore our model that have lasted and given us success will need to be sometimes totally thrown away, sometimes adapted to new environments and circumstances. Only when we do that, I think, can we sustain our competitiveness.
Thank you. We have 3 hours presentation and discussion, but it's quite a long time. We are going to just close this morning session. Please join me giving a big applause to presenters and speakers and the discussants. And thank you all for joining us.
네, 원장님 감사합니다. 그리고 수고해주신 연사분들께도 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 그럼 이것으로써 오전 세션 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 잠시 후 앉아 계신 자리로 점심 식사가 제공될 예정입니다. 점심 식사 하신 다음에요. 오전 세션이 지금 끝났고 오후 세션은 2시부터 시작될 예정입니다. 그래서 점심 식사하신 다음에 2시부터 시작되는 오후 프로그램에도 많은 참여 부탁드리겠습니다. 감사합니다. So now first session is over. Shortly later, the lunch will be served to your seat. So, and our afternoon program will start at 12 o'clock. So I'd like to ask you to see you again in the afternoon session. Thank you very much, and I will see you after lunch. Thank you.